Here, Alicia decided the doctor was overzealous when he recommended Alzheimer screening on her 25th birthday. I like that because it really speaks to the emotional experience that probably most of us have in this room right now. We all worry about having Alzheimer's disease, but we don't want anybody to mention it to us, right? You don't want it to be noticed, and you don't want to have somebody think you have Alzheimer's disease, but we all worry about it. And we're going to talk more about that. Did anybody read the funnies, the Sunday funnies yesterday? This was in the Sunday funnies yesterday. This exact same cartoon, but this one is from 2021. And it's just a little bit different. So it's a Doonesbury, and he says, I lost my keys again? Have you tried useless dietary supplements? Do you suffer from mild forgetfulness? Well, it might be time for a placebo. Prevagen is the only placebo proven to stimulate denial in older adults with memory loss. How? Well, it contains a synthetic ingredient like one found in jellyfish, who have memories like elephants. Anecdotal results may vary, but 3 out of 4 pharmacists recommend Prevagen and other products they carry. Ask your pharmacist if spending $1,100 a year on Prevagen is right for you. Are placebos right for us? I forget. If they come in gummies, I'm down with gummies. The only way that this is different from the one that came out on Sunday was that the price was down to $750. And I wasn't sure if that was a memory problem by Trudeau or if that price actually came down. But it also speaks to a question that I'm sure will come up. Does Prevagen work? And there's just no evidence that Prevagen works. And so Trudeau is right in this funny. About 3 weeks ago, there was an article in the Psychiatric Times called "Alzheimer's Disease, Are the Treatments Worse Than the Illness?" And they talked about a couple of drugs that are being discussed a lot on the news. There were protests in Washington, D.C. this weekend about these drugs, that Medicare wasn't covering them. And I think it's worth just mentioning them before I get into the heart of my talk. So these are both monoclonal antibody drugs. So they were antibodies taken from older people who did not have dementia and were infused into people with high risk of dementia. And it was thought that this would help dissolve amyloid plaques. The problem is that aducanumab is expensive, $28,200 a year, and it reduces amyloid, but it doesn't appear to change cognition. So we've always thought that amyloid was the cause of Alzheimer's disease, but you can reduce it and still not have cognitive improvement. And that's the problem with aducanumab. The newer one, lecanemab, is not FDA approved, but it's on the shelf. It costs $26,500 a month. This one does seem to slow cognition by about 28% over 18 months, so that is better than the other one. But it's associated with death by stroke, and so it's not really quite prime time. So we have a couple of new drugs in the pipeline that are traditional medicines that, and by when I say traditional medicines, they're medicines that are used to treat a problem that has already occurred. That's what we do in medicine the best. We don't prevent problems, but we treat problems that have already occurred. And that's what these are for. But since they're not particularly ready for prime time, I thought we'd talk about some other strategies for thinking about dementia. So I mentioned this man, Dale Bredesen, because he was a sort of a cognitive mentor of mine. I became interested in brain health in the late teens, 2017, 2018, and began to look at different things that you could do to the brain that would improve brain health in general. And all of this was in the dementia literature. All of the studies that I was reading were in the dementia literature. Dale Bredesen happened to write a book in 2017, The End of Alzheimer's, in which he kind of cataloged all these things that have real strong scientific basis for reducing the risk of developing dementia. So I want to give credit to these people, Bredesen and others, who did all this bench research on brain health. So that brings us to our talk, preventing and reversing Alzheimer's disease. Is that possible? And I'm going to show you some ways that I think we can have an impact on those issues. This is a brain. The brain is, the front of the head is looking to your left and the back of the brain is to your right. The bottom is the cerebellum and the brainstem coming out below that. The brain is a large organ, very complex, and it's made of neurons. And this is now a cartoon of 2 neurons. And what's important about this slide is that it's this connection, the synapse and the axon, action potential goes down, that gets screwed up by Alzheimer's disease. There's plaques that develop on those that make the brain not work and begin to shrink. And this is a picture of a bunch of neurons, that's in the blue. And the yellow parts are, the thick yellow parts are amyloid plaques. The kind of fuzzy ones are what they call neurofibrillary tangles. And this is the pathology that we always see when we look at a brain that has Alzheimer's disease. This is the pathology that is pathognomonic of Alzheimer's disease. And this is what a brain looks like. A normal brain is on the left, and an advanced Alzheimer's brain is on the right. And you can see that it's smaller, right? So it's shrunk. You can see that the cavities are much bigger, again, meaning that it shrunk. It looks a lot different than the healthy brain, doesn't it? And that's obviously what we're trying to stop. And the news for today, if you take home, hopefully take home a few thoughts, but there are a few things that we can do to reverse cognitive decline and improve dementia and Alzheimer's by addressing. And they are insulin resistance, inflammation and infections, hormone, nutrient, and growth factor abnormalities, and abnormal toxin levels. And we're going to review those 4 things in greater detail as we go through this discussion today. So there's a few words of interest, kind of vocabulary building here for you. So first of all, what is dementia? Dementia is a broad category of brain diseases that cause a long-term and often gradual decrease in the ability to think and remember. It's great enough to affect a person's daily functioning. There's a few different kinds of dementia. Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia. It's probably 3/4 of dementias. It's a progressive mental deterioration that can occur in middle or old age due to generalized degeneration of the brain. It is the most common cause of cognitive decline in the elderly, and the pathognomonic feature is amyloid plaques. Those yellow things that you just saw a second ago. 2 more words, amyloid. So amyloid is the main component of amyloid plaques found in the brains of Alzheimer's patients. And then one that I really want you to try to hang on to, amyloid precursor protein. It's the protein that amyloid is made from. And I want to introduce the notion right now that it's really switching the change from amyloid precursor protein to amyloid, changing that from amyloid precursor protein to a benign a benign protein. In my office and other places that are interested in this kind of treatment, we do a big examination looking at a variety of laboratory factors that can cause Alzheimer's disease, that can affect how amyloid precursor protein is expressed. We find out which factors are abnormal. They're usually a limited number, and we try to address those. We also tried then to develop a personalized plan to address each abnormality, because there's a lot of different ways that you can get to the final pathway of amyloid production. A typical plan might address vitamin deficiencies, mineral deficiencies, and encourage exercise or diet. What is the story behind Alzheimer's disease? How does it occur? What is going on with this amyloid precursor protein and amyloid that causes these amyloid plaques? Well, this is an old story. Does anybody know who these people are? Well, of course, it's Adam and Eve, and Cain and Abel, right? You see, Abel's the good son who got killed by Cain. Cain is running away. Yeah, okay. I show this as a metaphor to talk about two things. First of all, they never had to worry about Alzheimer's disease because everybody died in their 50s, so it wasn't a problem. But the metaphor really is that when we think about amyloid precursor protein going to, there's two branches. It can be a good protein or it can be amyloid. It's similar to Eve having two sons. One was the so-called bad son, and the other one was the good son. And we want to figure out how to have her make more good sons and fewer bad sons. So amyloid precursor protein starts as a naturally occurring protein strand. Its fate is to be physically cut in one of two ways, depending on its environment. Depending on how it is cut, it can turn into either something healthy for the brain, Abel, or something toxic that makes amyloid, which the metaphor is Cain, right? And the things that determine if it's cut so that it makes the good protein or the bad protein are these four things. I'm going to review them again. Insulin levels, presence of inflammation and infections, hormone, nutrient, and growth factor levels, and toxin levels. And it's the mixture of those things around that amyloid precursor protein that determines whether it will be cut and turned into the good protein or the bad protein, which is amyloid. So this is a picture looking at the middle strand. The middle protein is amyloid precursor protein. If it's cut the way it is on the left one time, it makes a benign protein that is not a problem for the brain. If it's cut the way it is on the right, it makes amyloid, which is that A beta you see there. So we'll create A beta if it's cut in this way. And A beta, amyloid, is anti-trophic, which means it prevents growth, right? And it creates Alzheimer's disease. So we want to think about what is going on in the milieu that amyloid precursor protein is that will make it either be cut the way we want it to be cut on the left or the way it can be cut on the right to create amyloid. So again, using my metaphor, which really isn't very good, I struggled. I wanted to find something better, but Eva's the full protein. Abel is the protein on the left that's cut in a benign way, and Cain is the protein on the right that's cut in the way that is that causes Alzheimer's disease and makes amyloid. One of the problems is that if amyloid precursor protein is cut to produce amyloid, the way it was on the left, or on your right, excuse me, then amyloid can continue to cut amyloid precursor protein, forming more amyloid. So if the protein on the right occurs, amyloid is made, and that is a feedback loop to make more amyloid out of amyloid precursor protein. It feeds on itself, so you get more and more once it gets started. So again, it creates a positive feedback loop, creating more and more amyloid plaques in the brain instead of creating healthy molecules for the brain. And this just shows this in another way. The square on the top is APP, is amyloid precursor protein, and that can be made into this healthy protein, CTF alpha or amyloid beta. CTF alpha is healthy, amyloid beta is destructive. So the question then becomes, how do we deal with these four things that we know can worsen, can increase creation of the destructive amyloid beta protein by different sorts of behavioral things that we do or different medications we take. So the belief that amyloid plaque, the sticky plaque that builds up in the brain in Alzheimer's disease, is the main cause of Alzheimer's disease is actually incorrect. The main cause of Alzheimer's disease is what causes the amyloid to be created. It's that the amyloid precursor protein is cut in the wrong way. And that it does that because of different bad things in your brain that we're going to figure out how to get rid of tonight if we can. So amyloid is actually trying to do its best. It's responding to these problems, and it's the way the body in its wisdom tries to fix it. You know, if there's inflammation, it makes amyloid, because amyloid is like it has anti-inflammatory properties. With insulin, it's trying to fix a situation that's not normal. It's actually a protective response. And again, it is protective to inflammation, high insulin levels, suboptimal levels of nutrients and other synapse-supporting molecules, and toxic exposures. So our goal to prevent Alzheimer's disease is to take away the underlying causes of amyloid production, since they are the real causes of Alzheimer's disease. So again, there's four categories of Alzheimer's disease. One is primarily due to inflammation. The second is primarily due to high blood sugar. The third is primarily due to hormone, nutrient, and growth factor abnormalities. And the fourth is primarily due to toxins. And now we're going to begin to look at each of those. First, Alzheimer's disease due to inflammation. These are four things that I'm looking at when I'm wondering if you or I or anybody has Alzheimer's disease due to inflammation. First is advanced glycation end products. That's where if you have too much sugar in your body, it hooks onto proteins and it creates what are called advanced glycation end products. And they're proteins that don't work as well as they normally work because they're encumbered by sugar molecules. And have any of you ever heard of the lab test hemoglobin A1C? Hemoglobin A1C is a glycation end product. That's what it is. It's a protein that it goes higher if there's more sugar molecules hooked onto it. ApoE4 and ApoE3 are genetic variables. ApoE4 is the most common genetic variable to cause that's related to Alzheimer's disease. Then imbalances in fatty acids, having too many omega-6s and too few omega-3s. Infections of all kinds can cause inflammation in the brain. COVID, maybe. We're concerned about if that will, over the long haul, cause an increase in Alzheimer's disease. Insulin resistance, and then this one called leaky gut or leaky blood-brain barrier. What that is referring to is there are ways that molecules get in and out of the gut or into the brain, and the body keeps them from getting in or out by leaving the ways that they get in pretty small. Some people, for a variety of reasons, can have easier passageway from the gut into the body, into the blood. or into the brain, and that then triggers an inflammatory response. It triggers an autoimmune response. So that's one cause of inflammation. Like autoimmune diseases are often thought to be caused by that. And then toxins can cause inflammation. I mentioned that advanced glycation end products. I want to just show you a picture of it. I thought this was kind of cool, and so I wanted to show you guys. These are remoras, and remoras are little fish that hook on to big fish, okay? And here's a big fish, which has remoras hooked onto it. And you can imagine that big fish maybe isn't swimming quite as well as it would otherwise, right? Because it's kind of dragging along these remoras. And I think that's a good metaphor for what advanced glycation end products do. Is they burden proteins and make them not work as well. And that also triggers APP being converted into amyloid. The second big factor is Alzheimer's disease due to high blood sugar. So too much glucose in your body, diabetes, causes both inflammation and too much insulin in the brain. So there's an enzyme called insulin degrading enzyme that breaks down both insulin and amyloid. And you can imagine that if there's a lot of insulin, a hyperinsulinemic state like type 2 diabetes, that enzyme, insulin degrading enzyme, can be used up metabolizing insulin. That leaves not enough left to metabolize amyloid, and allows amyloid to build up. And that's how we think high blood sugar and hyperinsulinemia can cause Alzheimer's disease. Too much insulin decreases the insulin's ability to act as a growth factor too, which is another thing that insulin can do. The third of those four things is Alzheimer's disease due to hormone, nutrient, and growth factor abnormalities. And these are caused by imbalances in the endocrine system and the nutrient depletion. These are just some examples of problems that can cause this kind of dementia. So hormone imbalances of adrenal, sex hormones, neurosteroids and thyroid, insulin resistance, problems utilizing B vitamins, and nutrition depletion. And I mentioned these here. Later on, I'm going to just give you a list of different lab tests we look at to assess how any individual person is doing with respect to those events. And the fourth sort of kind of Alzheimer's disease is Alzheimer's disease due to toxins. So heavy metals would be an interesting example of one. So when you think about gold mining in the Black Hills, one of the concerns that people like me have is that there are heavy metals that get released and go from the top of the mountain to the bottom of the mountain. And what is that doing to people who drink that water? There is some evidence that, well, this is a statistical truth that the county of Meade County has a fairly high incidence compared to other counties in the country of neurodegenerative diseases. And it happens to be at the foot of Whitewood Creek, which is the watershed from Deadwood into the flatlands. So heavy metals are a concern. Hormonal imbalances become toxic. Hypothalamic pituitary axis imbalances. Chronic infections, things like mold, Lyme, other sort of indolent infections that most people don't have a problem with, but some people are genetically not able to manage as well. And then toxins like pesticides, nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories, proton pump inhibitors, statins and other drugs sometimes can be toxic to the brain. So it's worth having some concern about that when you look at the medications you're on. Okay, so questions about that. How Alzheimer's disease seems to evolve from amyloid precursor protein to amyloid, and then those four kinds of Alzheimer's disease. Any thoughts or questions? Sure. Right. That's true, and it can start when you're 20 or 15 or younger. It's one of the real concerns about, for instance, the high incidence of type 2 diabetes in children now, and obesity in children, metabolic syndrome in children, that they're at very young ages being exposed to high insulin levels, which, as I pointed out, can be a trigger for Alzheimer's disease. But they don't develop Alzheimer's disease when they're 15, but it builds up over time. The amyloid builds up, the plaques build up, the neurofibrillary tangers build up, and can develop into Alzheimer's disease. Yeah.
Back to metal. Help me understand, is that metal in the water?
Yeah.
Because of the rich?
Usually that's the main source. I mean, it could be from other sources, but that's I think a prime source for heavy metal exposure.
Which metals are you mostly concerned with? Lead, mercury, cadmium?
Yeah, all of those, and even any heavy metal can be toxic to the brain. Gold can itself. Mostly they keep the gold and get rid of the other stuff. Yeah, so lots of there's heavy metal screens that you can do that can look at that, and I mentioned, I didn't mention it, but copper was listed as another metal that can create problems.
Is tobacco a toxin?
Tobacco is a toxin, and it can worsen brain health and Alzheimer's disease too. Yeah. Sure. She didn't have enough. Well, so it depends on the type of diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is probably a genetically driven illness. It starts in childhood. Type 2 diabetes tends to evolve more over time. Yeah. Okay. Brain trauma can contribute to Alzheimer's. Yeah, it's probably got its own reason for causing dementia too. But yeah. Okay, so how do we stop it? What can we do? So in my mind, there's all these factors that we've talked about, and I've listed so many that you can't even remember them, I'm sure. I couldn't list them all to you without having a slide to look at. And think of those as the holes in this colander. And the way we try to stop Alzheimer's disease is by beginning to plug those holes when they're present. So, your colander may be different than mine, but if we can determine where your holes are and where your holes are, we could possibly plug them and make Alzheimer's disease less likely to occur. Or we could do that with anybody. And that's why we want to look at a variety of factors and then develop a personalized strategy for addressing it. So first what we do is establish a baseline. So we might do just a cognitive exam. Many of you probably had this. It's a simple 20-question test that you can, or it's not 20 questions, but it's a 20-point test, a 30-point test, that we do to screen for cognitive dysfunction. Another thing that is a good way of looking at what your baseline is doing an MRI scan with volumetrics. So you can look at the volume of your amygdala or your hippocampus or your frontal lobes and see how they are compared to normal. And you can begin to tell, you can see where you are, and you can set that as a baseline and try to prevent that from worsening. So we evaluate behavior, genetic markers, like that APOE3 and 4, hormones, do levels of hormones, metabolic factors, minerals, vitamins. And then we develop a personalized plan addressing and changing each individual's vulnerabilities by plugging the specific holes that they have open in that colander, so to speak. So the genetic evaluation generally involves a look at your APOE and your MTHFR. These are two genes. The APOE, usually for most of us, it's APOE3 or 4. APOE4 is the bad one. People with APOE4 have a 2 to 3 times increase in Alzheimer's disease. People with 2 APOE4s have a 10 to 12 times higher incidence of Alzheimer's disease, and it starts earlier. So why would you want to know that? If you found out that you had a 10 times greater chance of developing Alzheimer's disease than the average person, you might just not want to know that, right? But the truth is, you can change that if you change your behavior and you change and you take care of yourself properly. So you can, that is the genetic picture, but you can change the way your genes are expressed by doing different things to turn on and off that gene. So for me, I wanted to know, and I do have an APOE4, and it really helped me. I take care of myself, because of that. I'm more fastidious than I would be maybe otherwise. The MTHFR is a little bit less clearly related to dementia, but it is definitely related to emotional health, and there are some studies that suggest that it's there's a big Scandinavian study that suggested that if you have a certain variant of that gene, the MTHFR gene, you have about a 1% increase in Alzheimer's per year after about age 60. So it begins to add up. Yeah. 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 If you care, which you should do it at about 40. So we're all too late, right? But that is when you can do the most good. As Tim was saying, it builds up over time. So you want to stop it before it builds up to the point that it's causing you problems, right? But yeah, about 40, 45 is where people who are into this way of thinking think that you should really be looking, and then you should monitor yourself after that, or at least monitor the abnormal values after that. It's never too late. You can always have an impact on it, but as I think understand at this point, the more amyloid that does build up in your brain, the more likely you are to have problems. So you want to slow that process and minimize it as much as possible. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, we're not doing that yet, but it is. I just don't think it's quite prime time yet. It's my look at it, but it is an interesting thing to begin to look at and to pay attention to. It hopefully will show us what your amyloid burden is, so to speak. Right now, really the best way to do that is using functional MRI scans or PET scans. And those are just a little bit too expensive to do on everybody who you're worried about. Yeah. No, it's not necessary. It just gives you a baseline. So it might, if you did an MRI scan and you found that your hippocampus was small, it might say, I better get my ass in gear and change my lifestyle. You know? And that's what a lot of these do, is they kind of kick you to, you know, I better pay attention to this because, you know, I don't want to have an evolving process of Alzheimer's. So these next few slides I'm going to go through pretty quick because it's really more than you're going to ever be able to absorb. The reason I put them on here is because I wanted you to have these on the sheets that you have, and I wanted you to be able to take them to your doctor, and if you want to have this done, ask them to look at these labs. So I'm giving you a list here. I'm not going to go into detail about each one of them, but I want you to know that they are all things that I have looked at and researched. I've got papers on every one of them that describe how they affect brain health negatively. And you probably may already know these things. The papers are in kind of the general popular literature, actually, many of them. But so vitamin assessment, a homocysteine level looks at your folic, your actual active folic acid level, as opposed to just your folic acid level. Vitamins B6, B12, and regular folate levels. Vitamin D3, so vitamin D, almost everybody's low in that. Vitamin E level, it's not common that that's low, but some people have a low vitamin E level, and that usually is related to GI problems. And then the red blood cell thiamine level, which is usually only low if you've been drinking a lot of alcohol. The second group is metabolic factors. We're looking here for insulin resistance, like I was mentioning before. High insulin levels, high blood sugar levels can trigger Alzheimer's disease. In fact, there are people who call Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes. So type 1 is the genetically triggered diabetes in young people. Type 2 is the kind of diabetes that most people have in our culture who have diabetes, and that's really due to metabolic syndrome, weight gain, that sort of thing. Type 3 is people who use that term, and it's not universally used, but it refers to Alzheimer's disease, which seems to be caused by blood sugar dysregulation. So a fasting insulin is useful. You can, if you are fasting, your insulin should be very low because you don't need it to drive sugar into your cells. But if it's high, it means that you've got high insulin, you're hyperinsulinemic even without a trigger for it. And that tells you that you're developing diabetes. It's one of the first things that suggests diabetes. Hemoglobin A1C comes along a little bit later. And then cholesterol, other lipids, different kinds of lipoproteins. And I mentioned at the very bottom, so in cardiology, they're trying to drive your cholesterol down really low, right? But you should be aware that if it gets below about 150, you might create brain problems. So think of it like this. Your brain is about 80% fat, and it's 80% lipids, and it's made of these lipids that we don't like in our blood vessels, but can be helpful in our brain. So you want to be, so there's a balance there, I guess, and I'm just suggesting that it depends on your situation. If you've had a heart attack, you drive it down because you don't want to risk having another heart attack because you die. But if you have a history of dementia in your family, or if you've got an ApoE4 gene, you might say, I'm going to leave my cholesterol a little bit higher. Different hormones. So most places will do a TSH and a free T4 when they look at your thyroid. We look at your free T3 and your reverse T3 because for a variety of complex reasons, they tell you more information, and it's important for brain health. Sex hormones, adrenal hormones, we check. Some of these you may have heard of and some of them you may have not of, but pregnenolone is one probably most people haven't heard of. It's a precursor for sex hormones and adrenal hormones. And it also is a precursor for what are called neurosteroids that modulate brain neurotransmission. And if you get too little of that, it triggers higher levels of anxiety, for instance, and probably triggers a hyperexcitation syndrome in the brain that can also worsen amyloid production. We're looking with all of these. We don't want any of these things that we're testing to be supra-physiologic, too high, more than is in the normal range. We want them to be in the high normal range. It makes sense, right, in a way? If vitamin D is good for you, just as an example, and does all kinds of great things, which it does, you wouldn't say, well, I want to have the very lowest vitamin D level I can have. You'd say, well, I'd like a solid vitamin D level in order to get a good response. I mean, that's a simplistic description, but essentially that is the way I'm thinking about all of these, is trying to make them in the normal or high normal physiologic range. Then we look for evidence of inflammation. HSC reactive protein is a general indicator of inflammation in your body, and we'd like that to be low. Everybody, when they check a liver panel, checks an albumin globulin ratio. I think it's important because globulins are immunoglobulins, so they get higher when there's inflammation going on. So if they are high, it suggests that you have some kind of inflammatory process going on in your body. So that ratio, if the globulins are high, that ratio would be low, and that would be bad. If they're not high, then that ratio would be high, and that would be good. Just mention omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. This is omega-6s and omega-3s function differently. They both are needed, but we need more in our culture. The way we eat, we tend to have more omega-6s and less omega-3s. Omega-3s are really important because they have an anti-inflammatory component. So if you're trying to reduce your inflammation level, eating fish or taking a supplement that is high in omega-3 is helpful. So for instance, we're going to talk about this in a minute, but grass-fed versus grain-fed beef or chicken or eggs or anything that animals eat, grain-fed tends to have higher omega-6s and lower omega-3s, and which causes more inflammation because the omega-3s are low, and it's one of the reasons in a few minutes I'm going to talk about not eating grain-fed meat but eating grass-fed meat. Metals, we measure copper and zinc levels, selenium, glutathione, potassium, magnesium. We do a heavy metal screen, and then toxins are kind of hard to measure, but there are certain labs that you can do them with, not actually in this area, but they are worth considering too. So then we do, it's not just labs, and in fact the labs are maybe the least important thing, but they just happen to be something that is an important piece of the puzzle. We do a behavioral assessment. We work with people on thinking about having a BMI of about 18 to 25. You can figure out what your BMI is by using this BMI calculator. Just Google BMI calculator, it will tell you. We want to rule out sleep apnea because sleep is one of the 5 key things that we think are important for brain health. When you are sleeping, and I don't go into that very much in this talk, but when you are sleeping, your brain detoxifies. It actually opens up the pathways for toxins in your brain to get into your veins and flow out of your brain. So sleep is crucial. It doesn't do that if you're awake. Assess exercise. We aim for 30 to 60 minutes, 4 to 6 days a week. We encourage people to think about it. We try to define meditative experience that they are comfortable with and that they normally do, and encourage them to use those. Or if they don't do any, we try to help them develop them. We work on socialization. Then we also work with people on fasting for up to 12 hours a day. So that means from dinner till sometime in the morning for most people. Essentially that means don't eat after dinner. How many here have a snack after dinner sometimes? Yeah, I do too. But I know it's not good to do, and I try to limit it, as much as possible. But if you're with friends and you're out for dinner, and maybe split a dessert, I'm just saying there's situations, and we're not trying to be Nazis about this. We're just trying to change general lifestyle patterns. So another thing that we work on with people on doing is enhancing ketosis, and that's where this fasting, this 12-hour or greater fast comes in. So ketone bodies, or ketosis, occurs when you break down fat for energy. It doesn't occur when you break down sugar for energy. It's just when you break down fat. So that you only break down fat for energy when you're running low on sugar, or carbohydrates that break down into sugar. So you've got to not eat sugar or carbohydrates that turn into sugar if you want to become ketotic. And mild ketosis is good because there's a ketone that's called beta-hydroxybutyrate that increases the production of a hormone that is like the fountain of youth for your brain, called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And brain-derived neurotrophic factor means brain-derived from your brain. Neuron trophic is growth. So from your brain, nerve growth factor. So there's a hormone that literally makes your brain grow. And if we're thinking about dementia, that sounds good, right? I mean, we don't want the small brain that we had up there early on. We want the robust brain. So think about getting ketotic. This is just a picture of how that works. There's several different things that can cause ketosis and cause increased brain-derived neurotrophic factor, but exercise would be one example. When you exercise, if you get into a fat-burning mode where you exercise enough so that you're not burning sugar anymore, you're burning fat, your liver produces ketones. Those ketones can get into the brain, and they activate histone deacetylase, which is a gene, to make brain-derived neurotrophic factor. That's what BDNF is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So, and that makes you smarter, so to speak. It makes your brain grow. So, this sounds good, right? So let's all go for a run right now. I was telling Mandy that I had a patient who I was talking to about this, and she went and signed up at a health club, and she said, she went and she was wiggling and squirming and jumping, and she said it was all good except for it was an hour before she got into her leotard and could actually start the workout. But there's all kinds of exercise, right? So again, why do we like BDNF? Why do we like exercise and other things that can cause that? It helps your brain adapt and learn. It improves all forms of plasticity. So plasticity means the ability to change, to grow more neurons, to change where the synapses are connected in your brain. And if you look at a really healthy, active brain, if you were to look at it microscopically, you'd see it moving and doing all kinds of, there'd be all kinds of things happening inside of it, lots of action. And you can control these BDNF levels by doing these things, by exercising, by sleeping. Good sleep helps BDNF production. Nutrition, fat and sugar cause less BDNF. And by managing your stress, so your cortisol level is not high, because that can worsen BDNF. So here's a potential ketone enhancing plan. Use low carbohydrate and sugar diet. Exercise 30 to 60 minutes, 4 to 6 times a day. Fast for 12 hours between dinner and breakfast. Consume fats like olive oil, avocado, and nuts, not bad fats. And consume a primarily plant-based diet. So, kind of getting a little bit more granular, I want to talk about what kind of diet you should think about eating. We've talked about exercise some, how about diets? So we want to make foods with a glycemic load less than 20 of the bulk of your diet. So that means lots of vegetables and fruits and less processed foods, less meats, that sort of thing. We want to eat whole fruits instead of fruit juices. Fruit juices are concentrated sugar, so don't drink fruit juice. Eat a banana or eat an orange. Avoid saturated fats like French fries and things that have a lack of fiber like white bread. Keep gluten and dairy a limited part of your diet. Avoid gluten and dairy if you have gluten and lactose sensitivity. Eat detoxifying plants like these ones listed number 5, and those are lots of vegetables, right? Vegetables are good for you in many ways, but be sure that they don't have pesticides on them because that brings in other kinds of toxins. So you gotta either wash them, use organic food, that sort of thing. Include good fats like avocados, nuts, seeds, olive oil. Whenever I use olive oil, I always drink a tablespoon of olive oil just for good measure because it's really good for you. Eat whole foods, avoid processed foods. Fish are optional, but generally good, but avoid largemouth, long-lived species like shark, swordfish, and tuna because they tend to bring in more mercury through their long lifespan, mercury that's in the water. Shift from a high meat diet to a low meat diet, and then eat grass-fed meat, mentioned that before. And eggs instead of more omega-3 fatty acids and fewer omega-6s. Probiotics might be included like fermented foods like sauerkraut or sour pickles or yogurt, especially if you have bowel problems. And then use supplements based on these lab evaluations that we talked about. It makes sense to me to find out what you're low in before you take a supplement to replace it. And then lifestyle adjustments. We talked about exercise, diet, meditation. Be sure you sleep well, protect your sleep, socialize, engage with other people, and do something to stimulate your brain. Like find something that turns you on and do it, and think about it, and work on it, and be part of it. We talked about biomarker modification. The biomarkers are those labs that we were talking about. So we may use supplements or vitamins or minerals or hormones, depending on the lab values. And so I'm throwing a lot at you, right? I mean, this is a big bunch of shit to dump on you tonight. I'm sorry about that. But, I ran into this Mark Twain saying that I thought was really good. The secret of getting ahead is getting started. The secret to getting started is breaking your overwhelming tasks into small, manageable tasks, and then starting on the first one. Set an exercise goal. It doesn't need to be running a marathon. It doesn't need to be running at all. It doesn't need to be swimming. It doesn't need to be dancing. It doesn't need to be riding a bike. It needs to be something. Start small, like for instance, if it's walking, how far can I walk tomorrow? I can walk a block. How far can I walk in 3 weeks? I think if I can walk a block tomorrow, if I keep doing that, maybe if I keep on extending that, in 3 weeks I'll be able to walk 2 blocks, some goal. And then maybe if I keep walking, I can walk to the top of Blackout Peak by the end of the summer. That'd be a cool goal. I personally have a goal of walking the Grand Canyon in September. And I'm not ready to do that today, but I'm gonna begin to walk and do other things to prepare my body to do that so that when September comes along, I think I'll be ready to do that and have a good time. Set a diet goal. Reduce soda to 1 drink per week instead of drinking 3 pops a day. Reduce desserts to 1 dessert per month. Don't have to take it all away, but make it a special occasion. Stop eating processed foods. These are just some examples, but you can imagine there are other goals that you could make based on some of the other things we've talked about. Try to eat mostly grass-fed meats or eggs, as an example, would be another goal. But just pick a few things at a time, like Mark Twain said, work on them, and then add on to that. Set a brain stimulation goal. Learn a new musical instrument. Learn a new language. Determine your passion and do it. Find something. You all have the ability to have a passion, something that is worth doing with this next part of your life, and figuring out a way to get engaged in that. What is important? What will make my life worthwhile for the next few years is really important, because that is what gives you the energy to have an active brain, to have the brain stimulation. This was a cool quote. There are only 2 mistakes one can make along the road to truth. First is not going all the way. Second is not starting. So we got to start and we got to stay with it if we're going to be successful with this kind of a plan. And I would just add that both require caring for your mind and your body, because whatever your passion is, whatever you love to do, you won't be able to do unless you care for your mind and body. And that is really the main reason why I'm talking to you today, so that you can be healthy and have a healthy brain that can do the things that you love and that you're passionate about.